Dr. Bertsch, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Look, can you tell us about the tests for COVID-19 in wastewater? Do they require further development, and can you explain what the tests tell us and what they don't tell us?
Yeah, sure, Mike. The testing wastewater for viruses or even chemicals is an area called wastewater-based epidemiology, and it's actually been practiced in many countries for viruses and other diseases for many, many years, and in fact, decades. And what we're doing around SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, is actually looking for specific gene fragments of the virus. So it's a molecular fingerprint. And so we collect the wastewater, we concentrate the virus, we extract the genetic material, which in this case is RNA. This virus has an RNA-encoded genome instead of DNA. And then we use a process that's very similar to what many of your viewers would be aware of in these crime scene investigation shows, where you process that genetic material and put it in a machine that's really a molecular photocopier, and you make millions, up to 1 billion copies of the gene so that you can actually determine that it is present or not in the sample.
Do you have the same issues that's been associated with PCR test performed on people, and how accurate are they, and how do you avoid false positives?
Well, we do. You can imagine wastewater being a much more complex media than humid fluids. And so there's actually quite a bit more involved in terms of getting around some of the potential problems. But yeah, it's really about good laboratory control and workflows, QA/QC protocols. But it also goes all the way back to sampling, and so sampling in the field, much like the human testing as well. Some of the early false positives were just due to sampling errors and cross-contamination. So again, this is a bit more challenging in a way because you're sampling wastewater, transporting it to a lab, and then processing it. And so, yeah, there are potentials certainly for false positives. But if you have well-trained personnel and as I mentioned, the workflows and the QA/QC protocol, false positives aren't really a problem. What's more troubling is false negatives.
Why would that be?
Well, so the false negatives is because wastewater is quite complex, and it does go, as I mentioned, to the sampling. So we've looked at different sampling methods, for example, and found that having to integrate sampling over a 24-hour period is pretty critical to get a reasonable sample. But oftentimes, some of the testing testing authorities are just going out and taking what's known as a grab sample. So just going out and dipping a sampler into the wastewater. So they're taking a single sample, and we find that's quite unreliable. And then all the way through to processing the material. So concentrating the virus, for example, we've optimized those methods, and we've been able to increase the efficiency of capture of the virus up to about 67%. But there are methods being used around the world that are only 2% efficient. And so you can imagine then, if you're at a low concentration already, if you have just taken a grab sample, which is going to be quite variable and oftentimes not nearly as sensitive as a integrated sample over time, then all of those things really add up, Mike, to where you can get these false negatives when the virus is actually present in wastewater. So it is tricky, but there are ways to use the best protocol that are available globally. And there's a global collaboration that's going on that's quite active in terms of continually improving methods. And our folks in CSIRO are at the forefront of developing those.
We hear, and it's becoming a little more regular than I would like, we hear of these samples being taken in various locales, such as in Townsville in Queensland and Rockhampton and the Gold Coast, and you start to fear that it may be politicised, that it's going to become a lockdown or whatever the government would like to do. How accurate, though, are you pinpointing, getting the right location of these carriers, and is this, cause for concern?
Well, so there's another positive test that some people call false positive. We wouldn't, and that is individuals that recover continue to shed the virus. They shed the virus at relatively low levels, and it's most likely that they're not infectious. But we have evidence now from an individual in Cairns where we were getting positives for some time that individual actually tested positive in a clinical test 8 weeks after they had recovered. And it turns out that they weren't positive, but the nasal pharyngeal swab, which is the one that they oftentimes give to humans, came up positive. And then they came up negative the next day. But it was clear that individual was shedding the virus, even though they were recovered and not infectious. And we were likely picking up their signature in the wastewater. And so we can also get an idea about the relative intensity, how much is out there. So, for example, as we looked through February and March, our wastewater results tracked very well with clinical data. And so what you're really trying to do with this test is get those early warning detection. And you'll know here in Queensland, the chief health officer talks about those positives and mentions that it could be someone that's recovered. We don't know. There's no need for fear at this stage, but it does raise awareness. And they do then set up pop-up testing stations and really request that people go and get tested if they're showing any symptoms. Because one of the problems right now, Mike, for us here in Australia more generally, but certainly here in Queensland, is complacency. And as you've seen, these outbreaks can occur very, very quickly and spread very rapidly, especially with these new variants. And so it's really important to get it early and have the reasonable public health response.
Interesting you mentioned the complacency thing. I totally agree with you. Go back 6 weeks ago, maybe 8 weeks ago, and everywhere you walked there was hand sanitizer, and there was this, so many in the store, and or so many in the entertainment venue. And I can tell you now that's just gone out of the window. Even at gyms, there used to be wiping down and all this sort of stuff. It's almost stopped, and that complacency bit, whether it's just a Queensland thing that she'll be right, mate, or whether we've become immune to the information that's been pumped out to us from government and from other authorities. So you're dead right about the complacency. What do you feel about that? Do you think we need to just sort of kickstart ourselves and get back into being, cleaning our hands and making sure we're 1.5 meters away if we can, and just little things?
Yes, I think we're going to be managing this for some time, Mike, and we're going to have to continue to remember to practice those good hygiene practices, as well as social distancing whenever possible. And yeah, I mean, I think the complacency risk is quite large, and I find that Queensland Health uses the wastewater data just to continue to use to raise that awareness. The virus is circulating in the community. At this stage, it's likely low levels. It may not be an individual that's contagious within the community, but please, be aware that you need to practice good hygiene and get tested if you have even very mild symptoms. Because one of the things that one of the powers of wastewater-based epidemiology is that we know that individuals that are pre-symptomatic, that is, haven't yet displayed symptoms even though they're infected, or more importantly, those that are asymptomatic. And the percent of individuals that are asymptomatic, that is, individuals that never show symptoms, is quite high. So it ranges between 40 and 60% globally, and so that's a high number. So you have people in the community that could be spreading the virus that causes COVID-19, and not even know that they're doing that, of course. And again, the wastewater signal would emerge, and we would know, and we could pinpoint where that was happening and take the appropriate public health intervention actions in that specific area. What's
the frequency and number of tests done so far in Australia?
Mike, I don't know over all of Australia because there's differences in testing in the different jurisdictions. So some states, as you know, like Queensland, Victoria, and New South Wales, are actually posting their data online. Others aren't. And so it's really difficult for me to give you a view of all of Australia. But since we are working quite closely with Queensland Health, I can tell you that they're measuring 42 wastewater treatment plants on a regular basis, twice a week, and that covers 70% of the population of Queensland. So it's quite significant, and to date we've run well over 1,000 samples, and we continue to increase the frequency and as well as the number based on Queensland Health's appetite of even going to individual assets such as prisons, for example, or smaller communities. And we are in the process of developing some test methods that could actually be passive, which would be much easier in remote areas, for example.
Fascinating. Yet another weapon in the fight against COVID-19. It's good to know that the Queensland Government and the CSIRO, that our business is your business, so to speak. Paul, thank you very much for your time, and all the best.
Thank you, Mike.